Imagine you are a general, not a reckless general, not an incompetent one, a careful, experienced military commander who has spent decades studying the history of wars in your region. You have watched enemies arm themselves. You have watched diplomats fail. You have watched the clock. And now, sitting across from you on the map table, is a country that has publicly stated it wishes to erase yours from the face of the earth. And that is months, perhaps weeks, from the capability to do exactly that. You strike first. You destroy the facilities. You set their program back by years. The world condemns you. Your ally defends you. And then, 6 months later, you look at the region and ask yourself, did it work? Or did you simply light a fuse you cannot extinguish? That is the question at the center of everything happening right now between Israel, the United States, and Iran. Welcome to History Repeating. I am your host, and today we are placing one of the most consequential military escalations of the 21st century inside the longer story that produced it. Because the longer story, as always, tells us things the breaking news cannot. Israel and the United States have launched coordinated strikes against Iranian nuclear and military infrastructure. The strikes targeted uranium enrichment facilities at Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan, ballistic missile sites, and command and control infrastructure connected to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. Iran has declared it will respond. The region is holding its breath. If any part of this feels familiar to you, it should. This is not the first time a Middle Eastern power with nuclear ambitions was struck by a neighbor with regional dominance at stake. It is not the first time the United States found itself supporting a preemptive military strike against a non-nuclear adversary. And it is not the first time the world has watched a cascade of events that everyone could see coming and nobody seemed able to stop. History does not just tell us what happened. It tells us what tends to happen next. And right now, that is the most important question anyone can ask. Part 1. What actually happened and why it matters. Before we go anywhere in time, we need to establish exactly where we are. Iran's nuclear program is not new. It has been the central anxiety of Middle Eastern geopolitics for more than 2 decades. Iran began accelerating its uranium enrichment program in the early 2000s. By 2015, the Obama administration, working with Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and China, negotiated the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, which imposed strict limits on Iran's enrichment activities in exchange for relief from international sanctions. The deal was controversial. Critics said it delayed but did not end Iran's path to a nuclear weapon. Supporters argued it was the most effective restraint available short of war. In 2018, the Trump administration withdrew the United States from the JCPOA, reimposing sanctions and pursuing a policy of maximum pressure. Iran responded by gradually abandoning its JCPOA commitments. By the early 2000s, Iran was enriching uranium to levels that no civilian nuclear program requires. International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors reported that Iran had accumulated enough enriched material that, if further processed, could fuel multiple nuclear weapons. The IAEA lost the ability to fully monitor certain facilities. The window for diplomacy, which had already been narrow, was closing. Israel had been watching all of this with a degree of alarm that its leaders did not bother to conceal. Prime Minister after Prime Minister stated publicly that Israel would not allow Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon. This was not bluster. It was a strategic red line, backed by a documented history of action. A history we are going to examine in detail. The strikes that have now taken place represent the largest Israeli military operation in Iranian territory in history, and the first direct U.S. military participation in offensive operations against Iran. The scale and coordination signal something different from past shadow conflicts. This is not a covert assassination or a cyber attack. This is an act of war between states, and its consequences will be measured not in days, but in years. Part 2. The Osirak Precedent and Why It Is Misremembered. To understand what Israel did and why it believed it could work, you have to understand June 7, 1981. On that date, 8 Israeli F-16 fighter jets, escorted by 6 F-15s, flew a low-altitude route through Saudi and Jordanian airspace and bombed the Osirak nuclear reactor outside Baghdad, Iraq. The reactor had been sold to Saddam Hussein's government by France and was weeks away from becoming operational. Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin had made a calculation. Once the reactor went hot, destroying it would spread radioactive contamination over a densely populated area. The window for a clean strike was closing. Israel acted. The world's reaction was nearly unanimous condemnation. The United States voted with the rest of the United Nations Security Council to censure Israel. Iraq, despite being the target, received international sympathy. Many experts said Israel had violated international law and set a dangerous precedent for preemptive military strikes against civilian nuclear infrastructure. And then came the Gulf War, 10 years later. When American-led coalition forces defeated Iraq in 1991, they discovered something that reshaped how the world understood the 1981 strike. Saddam Hussein's nuclear program had not been destroyed at Osirak. It had been driven underground. Iraq had rebuilt and expanded its weapons program using different facilities, different methods, and considerable ingenuity. The post-war inspections revealed a program that was far more advanced than Western intelligence had believed. A program that, had the Gulf War not intervened, might have produced a nuclear weapon by the mid-1990s. The lesson that many drew from Osirak was therefore complicated. Yes, the strike had delayed the Iraqi program, but it had not ended it. It had dispersed it. It had made it harder to monitor. And it had not changed the fundamental strategic calculation of the Iraqi leadership, which remained committed to nuclear acquisition until the regime itself was destroyed. Israel drew a different lesson than most of its critics. The lesson Israel drew was, strike early, strike hard, and accept the international condemnation, because the alternative is a nuclear-armed adversary. That lesson has now been applied to Iran. The question history asks us to examine is whether the lesson from Osirak actually applies, or whether Iran in 2026 is a fundamentally different problem than Iraq in 1981. Part 3. Iran is not Iraq. The differences that history demands we acknowledge. The Osirak comparison is tempting, and Israeli officials have explicitly invoked it. But the differences between the Iraqi program in 1981 and the Iranian program today are large enough that the analogy requires serious qualification. First, dispersal and hardening. Iraq's nuclear program in 1981 was concentrated at a single above-ground facility. Iran's program is spread across dozens of sites, many of them built deep underground precisely because Iran's leaders watched what happened to Iraq and drew their own conclusions. The Fordo facility, for example, is buried more than 80 meters beneath a mountain outside Qom. For years, American officials debated whether the munitions existed that could reliably destroy it. The strikes that have taken place will take weeks to assess for actual damage, and Iranian officials are already making public claims, the credibility of which neither side can independently verify, about what survived. Second, regional reach. Saddam Hussein in 1981 had neighbors who feared him but was geopolitically contained. Iran, in 2026, has spent 40 years building a network of proxy forces across the region. Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen, Shia militias across Iraq and Syria. These are not just diplomatic levers. They are military assets that can be activated in response to strikes on Iranian soil. A strike on Iraq in 1981 risked Iraqi retaliation. A strike on Iran in 2026 risks retaliation from 6 different directions simultaneously. Some of it aimed at Israel, some at American bases, some at Gulf state infrastructure, some at global shipping lanes. Third, the nuclear threshold. In 1981, Iraq was building toward a nuclear capability it did not yet have. Iran, by the most credible current assessments, is weeks to months from nuclear breakout, meaning the ability to produce weapons-grade material quickly if the political decision is made. A strike on a program at this stage does not simply delay acquisition. It creates an immediate incentive calculation. Does Iran now accelerate toward a weapon as fast as possible, reasoning that a nuclear deterrent is the only thing that prevents future strikes? Or does it conclude that the cost of nuclear pursuit is too high? History suggests the former is far more likely than the latter. Part 4. The Shadow of Suez. When allies diverge. There is another historical parallel that has received far less attention than Osirak, and I think it is more instructive for understanding where we are headed. In October 1956, Israel, Britain, and France launched a coordinated military operation against Egypt following President Nasser's nationalization of the Suez Canal. The plan was carefully orchestrated. Israel would attack first, then Britain and France would intervene under the pretense of separating the combatants, seizing the canal in the process. It was an operation built on a web of private agreements that the Eisenhower administration did not know about until the bombs were already falling. Eisenhower was furious, not because he was sympathetic to Nasser, but because the operation had been launched without American knowledge or approval, destabilizing a region where the United States had its own Cold War interests, and providing the Soviet Union with a propaganda windfall at precisely the moment Soviet tanks were crushing the Hungarian uprising. Eisenhower used American economic leverage, threatening to withhold support for the British pound, which was under enormous pressure, to force Britain, France, and Israel to withdraw. The operation ended in humiliation for Britain and France, and in a deeply uncomfortable diplomatic standoff between the United States and Israel. Suez established something important. American support for Israeli military operations is not unconditional, and when that support fractures, the consequences for Israel are severe. The current strikes are different from Suez in one critical respect. They involve direct American participation, meaning the United States has chosen to absorb the political and strategic costs alongside Israel rather than standing apart from them. That is a significant commitment. It is also a significant constraint. Having participated, the United States is now directly implicated in whatever follows. The lesson of Suez is not simply that allies can disagree. It is that military operations launched in a shared regional context create interdependencies that neither party fully controls. Israel cannot manage an Iranian escalation without American support. The United States cannot manage the regional fallout without Israeli restraint. Each party now holds the other's strategic future partly in its hands. That is not a comfortable position for either. Part 5. What history tells us about what comes next. Let's do what this channel was built to do, and look at what history actually predicts about the aftermath of a major strike on Iranian nuclear infrastructure. The first thing history tells us is that targeted states do not simply accept the new reality. They adapt. After Osirak, Iraq rebuilt. After Israel's 2007 strike on a suspected Syrian nuclear facility, Syria accepted the outcome because the Assad regime calculated that open retaliation against Israel carried existential risk. Iran is neither Iraq nor Syria. It has the regional reach, the proxy network, and the domestic political incentives to respond in ways that neither of those governments could. The second thing history tells us is that preemptive strikes create legitimacy costs that compound over time. The international community's condemnation of Osirak took years to reverse. By the time the Gulf War revealed the extent of Iraq's program, Israel's 1981 strike had been quietly rehabilitated in Western strategic thinking. But Iran in 2026 is not Iraq in 1981. Iran is a signatory to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Its program, however suspect, has operated under international inspection regimes. A strike of this magnitude, with American participation, will be argued over in international forums for years, and those arguments will have real consequences for how the United States and Israel can build coalitions for future challenges. The third thing history tells us is perhaps the most important. Strikes that do not destroy a program entirely tend to accelerate the political will behind it. North Korea is the clearest example. The United States spent decades applying economic pressure, conducting joint exercises, issuing diplomatic warnings, and periodically threatening military action. North Korea responded to each escalation by moving faster, not slower. Today, North Korea has a nuclear arsenal that no one is seriously discussing destroying through military force because the costs of doing so would be catastrophic. The question that analysts across the world are asking right now is whether Iran, in the aftermath of these strikes, concludes that the only real security guarantee is a completed nuclear weapon, and whether the damage inflicted was severe enough to prevent that conclusion from being acted upon. Closing. History does not repeat, but it rhymes. We are in the early hours of something whose full shape we cannot yet see. The strikes have happened. The responses are coming. The region is recalculating. What history gives us in moments like this is not a prediction. It gives us a set of patterns, a vocabulary for what we are seeing, and an honest reckoning with what has and has not worked before. Osirak bought time, but did not end the Iraqi program. Suez demonstrated that even coordinated Allied operations can fracture on the hard reality of strategic divergence. Every preemptive strike in modern history has generated consequences its architects did not fully anticipate. Some manageable, some catastrophic, most somewhere in between. The people who planned these strikes are not naive. They have read the history. They have made a calculation that the risk of a nuclear-armed Iran outweighs the risks of what is unfolding now. That may be the right calculation. Or it may be the kind of calculation that looks defensible in the planning room and unravels in contact with a region that does not behave like a map. What history demands from the rest of us is that we hold the complexity, that we do not flatten this into a simple story of aggression or a simple story of legitimate self-defense, that we ask the questions that only the long view enables. What was actually destroyed and what survived? What has Iran decided in the aftermath? How are the proxy networks responding? What are Russia and China doing? Where is the Arab world, which fears both a nuclear Iran and an unchecked Israeli-American military operation in its backyard? These are the questions whose answers will determine whether we look back on this moment as the strike that prevented a catastrophe or the strike that triggered one. The historian Barbara Tuchman, writing about the chain of events that produced the First World War, a war that none of the major participants wanted in the form it took, described how leaders at each step made decisions that seemed locally rational and globally disastrous. She called it the March of Folly, the human capacity to pursue policies that are demonstrably against our own interests because the alternative requires admitting uncertainty, accepting short-term costs, or trusting adversaries we have been taught to despise. We are not in 1914. The parallels are imperfect, but the underlying dynamic, the way that individual decisions, each justifiable in isolation, can combine into outcomes no one chose, is as old as statecraft itself. And it is exactly what the history of preemptive military action in the Middle East asks us to take seriously. This is History Repeating. Thank you for watching and for thinking with me today. If this raised questions you want to explore further, I would start with Seymour Hersh's reporting on the planning for strikes against Iran, Trita Parsi's work on the history of Israeli-Iranian relations, and Tuchman's The March of Folly itself, which applies as well to our moment as to any she examined. If you found this useful, share it, not for the algorithm, but because the historical context matters, and the noise right now is very loud. Subscribe if you want to keep doing this kind of work together. Leave a comment. Tell me which historical parallel struck you most. Tell me what you think comes next. The past is not finished. It is working. And so are we.